Hey, hurry up, why haven't you opened up the coffin yet? Two figures holding flaming torches gave a vicious kick to the figure currently pushing against the coffin. Hey, you're getting more and more useless. Despite getting hit, the young male dressed in gray robes kept his slow and simple expression. He brushed against the crevices and chinks of the coffin before replying. It has a mechanism, need to search. And you still haven't found it? Worthless. One of the men got angry and kicked the boy again. That man kept silent as he circled the coffin before feeling something strange at the bottom. He slowly moved the object there back and forth before various thin wooden strips fell from the coffin's four corners. Holding the coffin lid with his arms, the boy used strength from his waist to push aside the 100 jin lid, where it fell heavily onto the ground. After the dust settled, the boy stood by the coffin to quietly peer at the girl within. Her once resplendent robes had rotted into black and smelly rags stuck to her skin. But more shocking than that was the fact that this girl's skin hadn't decayed at all. Her facial features were like that of a living person, carrying no hint of death. The torch flame waved about, causing the girl's eyelashes to flutter before she slowly opened her eyes. There was a flash of confusion in her eyes before they rolled in her sockets to stare at the boy beside her coffin. Ah, grave diggers. The man stared at her without moving, his reply dull and simple. Zombie. The two men standing behind the boy were alarmed as they asked, Song 16, do you know who's talking? 16 was stupefied. They're asking, who you are. Me. The girl says up, her rotten clothes sliding down her shoulders to reveal skin as fair as white jade. Inside, she wore a red dudao undergarment, her half-revealing form all the more enticing. But what kind of man would dare enjoy such a sight now? My name is Ꭲ⋯, Princess of Great Jin. Right now, I guess I'm a corpse. Zombie. It's a ghost. The two men throw aside their torches and half run, half stumbled out of the tomb, shrieking and howling all the way. Seeing them leave, 16 bent down to pick up an abandoned torch before walking out as well. But before he took a single step, he felt his sleeve get heavy. An abnormally pale hand grabbed onto him as Ꭲ⋯'s bright eyes looked up. Don't go, I want to eat you. Then she bit down on 16's wrist, only to knock her teeth painfully against the black iron shielding his skin. Unreconciled, she threw aside 16's sleeve and grabbed his arm with a large chomp. Aroo. Sharp fangs sank into 16's flesh, but Ꭲ⋯ hadn't started drinking his blood before she choked and pulled them out. Holding her stomach, she suddenly threw up a black sticky substance before covering her mouth in disbelief. A finger pointed accusingly at 16. How could you taste so bad? 16 stared at the beads of blood seeping from his wrist and replied, because, there's poison. 16 had been sold to grave robbers when he was a child and been forced to work in dangerous conditions. They treated him as a tool to scout graves and unlock coffins. Countless times, he'd gotten poisoned by various tombs until he gradually became poisonous himself. Between him and the corpse, it was hard to say just who was less human. 16 turned to leave again, but Ꭲ⋯ unexpectedly caught him a second time. He turned back to look at her. You cannot eat me. Since you dug me out, you have to take responsibilities. Ꭲ⋯ stared at him. I want to drink blood. Looking at the girl dressed in a solitary dudao, 16 was suddenly reminded of a child in swaddling clothes he'd seen once in the market, perched against its mother's chest as it yearned for milk. When 16 left the tomb, those two other grave robbers had long disappeared. Ꭲ⋯ jumped out from behind him, wearing 16's filter outer robes as she stared up at the moon, then swept her eyes at the quiet woods nearby. She felt rather resentful. Those two edibles escaped. Big head, your companions are gone, catch some things with blood in them for me. Those aren't companions, 16 said expressionlessly, are masters. They're useless masters. Ꭲ⋯ hopped along as she enjoined, although you're not tasty, I already cast a spell when I bit you. If you dare to run off on your own, I'll activate the spell and have you explode from the inside out. Only after Ꭲ⋯ brought this up did 16 realize he could have run away. As it turned out, he wasn't controlled by the grave robbers anymore. But he'd already fallen from one abyss into another. When 16 brought back some hairs, Ꭲ⋯ was currently gnawing on a tree branch. He blinked and asked curiously, what are you doing? Ꭲ⋯ spotted the hairs in his hands and cheerfully pounced, too lazy to even pluck the fur as she sank her fangs into its veins. Her voice came out garbled and unclear. Teeth itched, grinding them down. When 16 saw her sharp teeth, he suddenly had the urge to get a whetstone and help her grind them down. Ꭲ⎪ning sucked dry 2 hairs in a row before sitting down to rub her stomach in satisfaction. 16 cleaned up the 2 rabbits and started roasting them over a fire. The firelight flickered between the 2 figures before Ꭲ⎪ning suddenly spoke up. Oh, then let's do that. 16 bit off a piece of rabbit meat as he looked blankly at Ꭲ⎪ning. Help me get my revenge. What, revenge? Ꭲ⎪ gave an irrelevant answer. How long has it been since Great Jin's 8th year of Yuanwu? 323 years, and 2 months, 16 blurted out. Over 300 years, Ꭲ⎪ning said. My heart is full of indignation that didn't fade even when I died. Naturally, I need to satisfy my complaints before I can reincarnate. Right now, I'm not familiar with this era, nor do I know where to find my enemy. So you have to stay with me. Otherwise, I'll blow you up. 16 nodded. In any case, he had no idea where to go now that he'd left the grave robbers. Ꭲ⎪ stood up. I'm a Jiangshi, so I can't be exposed to sunlight. We'll travel at nighttime and rest during the day. Get up and get going. He usually spent his nights grave digging and resting during the daytime, so 16 nodded again. Grabbing a rabbit, he started eating and walking at the same time. Ꭲ⎪ hopped in front before seeing how much faster 16 was walking with the use of both his legs. Unhappy, she gave a pout. This won't do, you walk faster. Carry me. In any case, he was strong and Ꭲ⎪ didn't look all that heavy. Nodding once more, 16 obediently bent down so the Jiangshi could clamber up his back and hold on to his neck. Seeing Shiliu's neck, Ꭲ⎪ had to swallow the drool in her mouth. But once she recalled the disgusting flavor that made her want to upend the contents of her stomach, her head hung. She pulled at his shirt as she hung off his shoulders, grinding her teeth in dissatisfaction. Tomorrow, buy a shoulder pad for me to grind my teeth. Again, 16 nodded, allowing the Jiangshi to grind her teeth behind his back. After a while, Ꭲ⎪ couldn't bear her itchy teeth. Give me one of the rabbit's bones. 16 did as she said, but couldn't help asking, you a dog, or a mouse? Ꭲ⎪ slammed her head against his own. Speak for yourself. Hurry up. Going by Ꭲ⎪ng's words, they traveled by night and rested by day. 16 had to use his own resting time to buy something for Ꭲ⎪ng to grind her teeth with, such as bones, corn cobs, or his shoulder pad. He never realized that Ꭲ⎪ng's teeth were so formidable. In 5 days, she'd already worn through 2 shoulder pads. Sometimes, even the slow and dim-witted 16 thought of buying her a whetstone and stuffing it into her mouth so she could slow down a bit. On yet another evening, 16 had purchased the items Ꭲ⎪ng needed for her teeth when a hand grabbed him right beneath an inn. He turned around and recognized the 2 grave robbers who had run off the other night. Stupefied, he asked, What is it? What is it? I spent 5 taels of fine silver to buy you to work for me, but a mutt of a slave like you took the chance to run off. Follow me back and see how I'll break your legs. 16 was dragged 2 steps away before he suddenly recalled Ꭲ⎪ng's words and how she'd blow him up. He stilled his steps and stood as steady as Mount Tai while the 2 men tried to budge him. Won't go. When their previously obedient slaves suddenly started to rebel, the 2 men grew furious. One of them took out the leather whip at his side and started beating 16. He was used to getting beaten up, so he didn't resist. Instead, he stood stock still and allowed the lashes to leave bloody welts on his skin. Who gave you permission to beat him? A sharp voice cried out from above. Ꭲ⎪ng pushed open the 2nd-story window of the inn and flipped directly down to land in front of 16. A hand caught the whip and viciously tugged, catching its owner off guard. He staggered forward to kneel in front of Ꭲ⎪ng. Ꭲ⎪ng crept closer to his face and opened her mouth wide, revealing her sharp white teeth. I'll bite you to death. Her lips were black, her eyes like a cat's, scaring the man into backing up before crawling away from the scene. Monster. It's a monster. The other man had also been frightened, his face turning green at the memory of Ꭲ⎪ng's expression. Those eyes rolled back into his sockets as he fell into a dead faint. Ꭲ⎪ng grabbed 16's hand as she hopped towards the city gates. Let's go, they're going to lock the gates soon. Ꭲ⎪ng, teeth grinders, when he was being whipped, he dropped his things on the ground. Ꭲ⎪ng didn't give him any time to pick them up as she led him away. She seemed to be angry and fleeing from something at the same time. When 16 turned around, he saw a black-robed Taoist slowly stroll out from the inn. He touched the man who had fainted on the ground, then turned to look at them with a vague expression. Once they left the city gates behind them and entered the forests, Ꭲ⎪ng finally released 16. Right now, only the tip of the sun was peeking over the mountains, infusing the skies with a twilight glow. ᎢℋᎪNN squatted down and covered her face, closing herself off for a long time before speaking in a weak voice. The sun is so beautiful. 16 gave a start before he realized that Jiangxi shouldn't be exposed to sunlight. This should be ᎢℋᎪNN's first time seeing the sun since she'd woken up. He looked despondently at ᎢℋᎪNN until she raised her head. Her gaze pierced through the shade of the trees to stare at the multicolored sunset dyeing the skies. It seemed like her face had been injured by a burn, sporting terrifying red and white splotches. The sunlight's also very warm. I really want to see it one more time. Gazing at ᎢℋᎪNN's expression, the usually dull-faced 16 felt like he'd suddenly been bitten. A strange feeling rose from his heart. They hurried on with their journey at night. ᎢℋᎪNN had nothing to grind her teeth on, so she started to babble instead. The first thing she did was to scold 16. You're so strong, why don't you fight back against others who hit you? Even 10 of those men wouldn't be enough to win against you. 16 piggybacked ᎢℋᎪNNn with his head bowed, not daring to speak. It was only after ᎢℋᎪNNn got tired of lecturing that he replied, when I was young, I didn't know I could fight back. His parents had sold him when he was a small child. He had spent his entire life either being sold off or beaten. No one had ever taught him how to fight back, or that he had the right to counter in the first place. ᎢℋᎪNNn fell silent at his words before she sighed. In the past, one of my imperial brothers came back with a little tiger after his hunting trip. Because the tiger was too little, he left it to a mother dog to raise. That little tiger was always afraid of that dog. By the time it grew big enough to kill that dog in one bite, it was still afraid. ᎢℋᎪNNn reached out a hand and rubbed 16's head. There's no need to be afraid. You're strong, you just can't get past the demons in your heart. 16 didn't speak, so ᎢℋᎪNNn continued, see? There's already no one who can stop you from walking anymore. Indeed, 16's feet hadn't stopped moving, but he said, you can make me explode. ᎢℋᎪNNn blanked out before her lips drew up into a smile. You believed that? I was tricking you. There's no such spell at all. 16 nodded, silent as ever. ᎢℋᎪNNn asked, then aren't you leaving? For where? Hurry and escape from my side. Ah. I'm a zombie, I'll drink human blood. I'm poisonous, 16 replied succinctly. And, if I go, no one helps you, grinned your teeth. ᎢℋᎪNNn tightened her grip around his neck. You're a living human, but you're even more slow-witted than a zombie like me. In the future, can you stop speaking in bits and pieces? ᎢℋᎪNNn rubbed her teeth, which were beginning to grow itchy again. 16 grabbed one of his wrist bracers and placed it by ᎢℋᎪNN's side, indicating she could use it to grind down her teeth. I'll try to talk smoothly, he said. ᎢℋᎪNNn simply chomped down on the bracer. Traveling by night was a dull affair. Soon enough, 16's black iron bracers looked worse and worse for wear. ᎢℋᎪNNn stopped chewing on the bracer and started babbling again, slowly telling 16 her story. There were tales of the former Great Jin dynasty and its palace and her betrothed, the emperor's son-in-law. They'd never gotten married, but ᎢℋᎪNNn said she had adored him. In the end, I died by his hands. ᎢℋᎪNN's face was expressionless at these words, but when 16 turned to look at her, he felt she should be very sad. 16 turned back and kicked a pebble at his feet. He couldn't help but ask curiously, how did you die? ᎢℋᎪNNn shook her head, unwilling to say. She changed the topic instead. What about 16? Have you run into any fun stories before? Tell me some. Fun. 16 thought it over. I've run into you. For some reason, ᎢℋᎪNNn felt her face heat up from the careless remark. She soundly thwacked 16 on the head. Where did you learn to say such sweet things? 16 allowed himself to be beaten before he said, it's truth. ᎢℋᎪNN's head drooped over his shoulder as she looked absently at his neck. On the one hand, she was excited by the sight. On the other, she was recalling the awful taste of his blood. The two conflicting desires combined until ᎢℋᎪNNn stuck out her tongue and gave a vicious lick to 16's skin. 16's steps faltered, and ᎢℋᎪNNn asked, what now? 16 didn't understand the impulse in his heart, but he did feel his body getting hotter. It's like being bitten by a mosquito. ᎢℋᎪNNn soundly thwacked his head again. Your heart's no better than snakes and scorpions. Hurry up and keep walking. ᎢKᎪNNn had no idea where to find her former betrothed, so the two of them wandered towards the south. Jiangnan, the region south of the river, was filled with pleasant breezes in March. Once the sun set, 16 and ᎢKᎪNNn prepared their bags and got ready to leave the city. As soon as they stepped out of the inn, they saw a pregnant woman sprawled on the ground. Currently, the streets were cold and deserted, so there was no one around to assist her. ᎢℋᎪNN patted 16's shoulder. "Aya, hurry and help her up." 16 did as he was told, helping the pregnant woman to her feet. She'd just given thanks when they suddenly heard a cry. "Darling, darling." A man dressed in blue robes with an oil paper umbrella over his head quickly ran over. "Many thanks to this, sir, many thanks." He saw 16 carrying a cloth bundle on his back and asked, "Is this sir still looking for a place to stay? It's already getting dark, so why not stay with us tonight?" It was all pleasantries at most since they were already standing next to an inn. 16 wanted to refuse as well, but a female voice suddenly said, "Sure." ᎢℋᎪNN jumped her way to 16's side and grinned at the man with the umbrella. "Sure, sure. We just happen to need a place to stay. Many thanks to this sir for your cordial treatment." The man's expression stiffened, but he'd already spoken up. There was nothing else for it, so he simply supported his wife and smiled. "Since these two don't mind the offer, please come with us." The couple led the way while 16 and ᎢℋᎪNN followed behind them. 16 had a puzzled look as he asked, "Tonight, we're not journeying." ᎢℋᎪNN was staring fixedly at the back of the man in front of them. "Journeying? I've already found the person I'm looking for. The next journey I'll take is one of reincarnation." 16 stiffened. Did she find him? So as it turned out, that man was the betrothed she wanted revenge on. The very man she'd adored in the past, the one she'd never forgotten. 16 glanced at ᎢℋᎪNN's eyes, which didn't leave room for anyone else but her target, and felt his fingers twitch. He suddenly had an urge to turn her head towards him so she could see his agitation. But it didn't feel like he had that right. The two of them followed the couple to a small courtyard with 3 buildings. Husband and wife lived in one building while the kitchen took up another. 16 and ᎢℋᎪNNn went to the remaining room. Late at night, the pair with a completely different work-rest schedule to the rest of the world exchanged glances with wide eyes. 16 asked, "How do you want revenge?" ᎢℋᎪNNn fell silent for a long time. "I don't know, but I'll make him suffer. I loved him in the past, but he actually." ᎢℋᎪNN's sharp teeth bit through the skin of her lips, revealing a trace of blood. She suddenly thought up a good idea. "How about I force him to drink my blood so that he turns into a zombie too? This way, we'll be together forever and I can torment him as I like." 16's fists clenched by his sides. He lowered his eyes, trying his best to suppress the strange feeling getting stronger in his chest. "I'll go do that right now." ᎢℋᎪNNn straightened up and prepared to jump outside, but 16 grabbed her by the wrist. She turned back and saw his bowed head. A vexed 16 said, "Can't you not go?" This was 16's first ever request to ᎢℋᎪNNn. In the past, he simply gave her what she wanted. ᎢℋᎪNNn shot him an odd look. "Why? Are there other ways to take revenge?" 16 shook his head. "Can't you not take revenge?" He didn't know when, but he had started to wish ᎢℋᎪNNn would stop bringing up the past. He disliked it when she kept wanting to seek revenge. If possible, he'd want her to forget all about those former days and simply spend them happily with him while gnawing on his shoulder guards. ᎢℋᎪNNn furrowed her brows. "No way. I've been holding my breath for this moment and even turned into a monster. If I don't do anything at all, then what was the point of me waking up at all?" 16's grip tightened, his expression turning helpless. "I always thought." ᎢℋᎪNNn pried herself loose from his grip, finger after finger. "If we wait any longer, it'll be daylight. There's no time to lose. 16, you'll be free as soon as I turn my betrothed into a zombie. You won't need to waste any more of your life by my side." 16's face turned ashen. His grip increased in strength as his fingers wrapped around ᎢℋᎪNN's wrist. He was strong, to begin with, so his true power made even a zombie like ᎢℋᎪNNn helpless before his might. Stubbornly, he said, "I'm not going, I'll buy things, to grind your teeth." ᎢℋᎪNNn was starting to lose her temper as she raised her voice. "There's no need for you to buy them. I can just gnaw on my betrothed. I'm not going. You can't go, either." ᎢℋᎪNNn smacked him upside the head. "Have you lost your mind?" 16 lowered his head and allowed himself to be beaten without a word. All he did was hold on to ᎢℋᎪNN's wrist without a mind to let her go. By the time ᎢℋᎪNNn tired herself out, she asked him helplessly, "Just what do you want to do? If you don't want me, I don't know where to go." 16 finally lifted his head to look at ᎢℋᎪNNn, the helplessness in his eyes making her heart inexplicably ache. She suddenly felt like a remorseful criminal. She wanted to lift her hand and comfort 16 with a rub on his head but didn't know where the urge came from. It was obvious 16 was getting in her way, but she was the one feeling regret. She sighed before she heard someone knock on the door twice. The master of the house asked worriedly from outside, "Is anything the matter?" At the sound of his voice, 16 grew anxious. With a tug, he pulled Ꭲ⎪ towards him before wrapping his arms around her. Then he said, "No, nothing, you can leave." He had spoken so smoothly that Ꭲ⎪ looked at him in astonishment. Then she heard the person outside turning to leave, and cried out in alarm, "Hold it! Get back here!" The tone of voice was identical to her early days as a princess. 16 panicked and held her even tighter. The door opened as the master of the house entered with a lantern in hand. When he saw 16 and the woman in his arms both glaring his way, he scratched his head. "How did I offend these two? This is husband? What is it?" The mistress of the house had been jolted awake by the noise as well. Now she entered the room with a set of robes draped over her shoulders. Ꭲ⎪ seemed to grow possessed as she struggled free and hopped out of 16's shackles. With 2 great leaps, she threw herself at the woman. Alarmed, the man quickly drew his wife into his arms and backed into the courtyard to avoid the attack. Furious, he cried, "What do you want to do?" His wife was frightened as well, and hastened to ask, "Miss, what's happened to you?" 16 hurried out after them. He stepped forward to stop Ꭲ⎪, but she simply avoided him to pounce at the woman again, her eyes bloodshot. Her mouth opened wide and shouted, "Betrothed! Return my life to me!" 16 gave a start and staggered, nearly tumbling to the ground. The mistress of the house was even more surprised. Betrothed! Ꭲ⎪ pointed at the woman and boldly yelled, "Don't think I can't recognize you just because you're a woman in this lifetime. I clearly remember your eyebrows, that mole by your ear, and the birthmark next to your nose. You're my betrothed from the great Jin dynasty 300 years ago, the man who was set to marry me, Princess Ꭲ⎪." 16 gaped at the woman. So, the betrothed was someone else. The husband and wife exchanged glances before they looked at Ꭲ⎪ oddly. "Miss, what are you talking about?" Every word Ꭲ⎪ said, tears streaming down her face. "I was sickly since I was a child in my past life. When I turned 17 years old, I fell so ill that I became bedridden. It was you. All you. After I fainted, you broke into bitter sobs and held me so tightly that I died from suffocation. You murdering assassin. I loved you in vain. I loved you so much and yet you actually." 16 was stunned. Dead from suffocation. He was a simple-minded person, but even his expression was currently caught between laughter and tears. No wonder she said she'd been holding her breath until now. Meanwhile, the couple had caught on to something else entirely. Past life? They asked. Ꭲ⎪ fell silent before her hands clenched into fists. Her wrathful face held traces of sorrow. "What's even more unforgivable is that you got married not long after I died." 16 gave a start, before realizing this was the true source of Ꭲ⎪'s hatred. Ꭲ⎪ and her betrothed had been engaged since they were young. As a child, she loved to chase after her Finneque and call him Big Brother Ꭲ⎪, Big Brother Ꭲ⎪. Her body had always been weak, and a serious illness left her bedridden and unconscious when she was 17. Everyone had assumed that she died, but she still had a single breath left. Her betrothed had been so heartbroken that he'd taken her into his arms and wailed with grief. She had trouble breathing, to begin with, but his embrace effectively made her expire. After she was buried, her discontent soul kept lingering around Ꭲ⎪. She assumed that he would still harbor feelings for her even after she died, but never expected her childhood companion would end up marrying another woman by next spring. "You heartless, unfeeling man. Today I'm going to make you regret everything." Ꭲ⎪ prepared to jump, but 16 grabbed her by the waist from behind. Furious, she cried, "Let me go. I want to turn her into a zombie. How come she gets to reincarnate and spend each lifetime so happily? Why did I have to turn into something like this? I can't accept it." 16 kept silent as the sound of Ꭲ⎪'s sobs and screams filled the courtyard. Why did he forget me so soon? Why did I have to keep remembering him? How come he gets his happiness so easily? She struggled for a bit before realizing that 16 was much stronger. Ꭲ⎪'s head drooped before she murmured, "I just didn't want to be forgotten." Her tone was akin to the day she said the sun was beautiful. 16's breath caught, his heart aching painfully. "This, miss," the wife's voice said quietly, "although I don't quite understand your words, I know that if I died, I'd still want my husband to find someone who treats him well. Missing the dead is already painful enough. He shouldn't spend the rest of his life suffering because of me." If he can let go of his grief and spend days filled with hope again, it's not wrong. Even if I'm afraid of being forgotten, too. She turned back to look at her husband, and the two of two shared a smile. Ꭲ⋅ hung her head and didn't speak. A long time later, she tugged on 16's sleeve. Let's go. After leaving the couple's courtyard, Ꭲ⋅ rested herself against 16's shoulders. She neither spoke nor ground her teeth. 16 piggybacked her for a while before he suddenly spoke up. You can be happy too. Nobody will stop you, you just can't get past the demons in your heart. Ꭲ⋅'s former words have carved themselves into his heart like a scar that would never fade. He didn't know how to comfort others, but he could bring out the words he treated as scripture from his heart to her ears. Sometimes he felt like he and Ꭲ⋅ were similar. Or rather, maybe all people were the same when faced with difficulties, helpless, confused, and afraid. But people could learn to be stronger from those challenges, too. 16. Ꭲ⋅ suddenly shuffled against him. Thank you for today. It was a good thing he'd been there to stop her. After a moment of silence, Ꭲ⋅ added in a voice choked with sobs, but if I can't take revenge, where am I supposed to go now? How am I supposed to find my happiness? I'll give it to you. The blurted words scared both 16 himself and Ꭲ⋅. He thought it over and added, I'll give you teeth grinders. At this, Ꭲ⋅ patted 16's shoulders, signaling him to put her down. Then she took out a purse and made a bitter expression. We won't even be able to afford teeth grinders in the future. They'd already spent most of the money they made from selling off things in her tomb. I'll dig up graves for you, 16 said docilely. Ꭲ⋅ looked up at 16, seeing his earnest expression. Her heart softened as she enveloped him in a hug. I'm glad you were the one who dug me out. 16's face reddened. His heart felt like it was about to burst out of his chest. He'd never felt like this before. His hands hovered behind Ꭲ⋅, faltering over whether he should hug her back. It was almost daylight, so 16 piggybacked Ꭲ⋅ back to the inn they'd stayed at yesterday. Ꭲ⋅ was exhausted after all the fuss from last night and fell asleep gnawing on 16's shoulder guards. 16 gave the inn waiter a reservation fee and prepared to head upstairs when he saw a pair of boots on the threshold emblazoned with the yin-yang symbol. His eyes trailed up until he spotted a solemn-faced Taoist dressed in black robes at the top of the stairs. Ꭲ⋅ murmured sleepily on 16's shoulder as she smacked her lips. I want to drink blood. 16's hands tightened their grip on her as he gulped. Cold sweat broke out on his back. The expressionless Taoist descended the stairs. As he walked past them, he said lightly, humans and monsters walk different paths. She shouldn't be here. Once the footsteps were far away, 16 expelled a sigh of relief. But he suddenly realized he couldn't hear Ꭲ⋅ grinding her teeth anymore. When he turned around, he saw with surprise that he was piggybacking a giant log. The black-robed Taoist headlong grabbed Ꭲ⋅ by the collar and dragged her into the streets. The sun was slowly starting to peek its way past the eastern walls of the city. Despite this, Ꭲ⋅ didn't struggle in the Taoist grip at all but kept sleeping peacefully. 16 was seized with terror as he chased after them with a shout. Give her back. Give her, back to me. But no matter how furiously he chased, the black-robed Taoist was always 3 steps ahead of him. He couldn't touch Ꭲ⋅ no matter how he tried, nor pull her back to his side. The first rays of the morning sun shone upon Ꭲ⋅, revealing her porcelain-white skin. Her eyelashes quivered before she slowly opened her eyes, those dark pupils glittering brightly with the light of the sun. 16 couldn't help but still his steps, only to see her shut her eyes and murmur, a spring sun in March is good weather. He knew that Ꭲ⋅ had always loved the sun and that she should go on to reincarnate, now that she understood her heart. But, what about him? The black-robed Taoist was chanting an incantation to send on Ꭲ⋅. 16 didn't know where he got the guts, but he picked up a brick and threw it at the Taoist. It seemed to break through something, causing the air to shimmer. 16 next threw himself forward and pulled Ꭲ⋅ into his arms. He made sure to cover her up so no sunlight would touch her. In the shadow of 16's form, Ꭲ⋅'s face slowly turned red before emitting a cloud of white smoke that resembled burning steam. Fortunately, the morning sun wasn't strong enough to take her life. 16 held Ꭲ⋅ before he turned to flee, but the Taoist grabbed him. If you stay with a zombie, it'll hurt you sooner or later. I'm willing to face that. 16 shook off the Taoist with brute force and ran like mad. The city gates had just opened up when 16 rushed through them and into the forests. He dug out a hole and buried Ꭲ⋅ in the earth, only exposing her head. Xiuning's injuries slowly recovered within the earth while 16 kept tight watch over her condition. When he saw that she wasn't seriously injured, he finally stopped worrying. But when he recalled how she didn't even struggle in the Taoist clutches, much less give him a call, he realized she almost. Xiuning opened her eyes and looked at 16. I haven't reincarnated yet. 16 turned his head away and ignored her. 16 stared off into the distance, feeling stifled. Xiuning had an inkling of why he was mad, and said, I'm sorry. I never expected you to be so worried about me, I won't do it again. After she admitted her mistake, 16 gave up. He turned towards her and said angrily, you can lie down in the sun again if you want. I won't care, I definitely won't. Then he glared at her some more and added, next time? There won't be the next time. Xiuning blinked. 16, I realized that you're speaking much more smoothly now. You have more emotions than before, too. 16 was stunned by her praise. He suddenly forgot he was angry and scratched at his head instead, his face flushing. Xiuning narrowed her eyes. I say, do you like me or something? 16 was completely floored. Before Xiuning could laugh at him, he suddenly said, I don't know, whether or not, it's like. But, I dug you out, you're mine. No one can take you away, not even yourself. Xiuning was rather stunned by the sudden confession. The next thing she knew, 16's face had drawn close before he bit her neck and murmured, in the future, you have to grind my teeth, too. End of story.